What if Earth had two suns? Imagine waking up to a sky that never learned the word ordinary. Two stars climb the horizon like matched drumbeats. Sol, the familiar white blaze, and Ember, a slightly smaller amber torch. Their light braids across oceans, pushes shadows into double-edged blades, and turns every reflective surface into a hall of mirrors. Nights still exist, but they are rarer, shorter, and fiercely anticipated. When both suns set together, whole cities dim their voices to hear the forgotten language of darkness. In this world, seasons are chords, not notes. Day length swells and ebbs as the suns trace their slow celestial dance. Temperature gradients carve new wind systems across continents. The moon, bullied by twin gravities, writes new poems in the tide. Life evolves under layered light. Plants learn to budget their metabolism for too much day and not enough night, and predators refine a choreography for double shadows. Human eyes adapt to richer, chromatic detail. Languages bloom with 20 words for twilight, and calendars become instruments tuned to two rhythms. This is a chronicle told by a single witness, me, tracking the arc from the first fires to the last orbital arrays. Not of our Earth, but of an Earth that learned to live between two dawns. I begin where all good geographies start, with the map of the sky. Sol, the star we know, shares the firmament with Ember, a K-type companion that loops in a broad, stable ballet. Earth follows a circumbinary path, and the result is a day that is sometimes one light, sometimes two, rarely none. The suns rarely rise or set in perfect synchrony. Instead, the world becomes a music of phase offset. Sol dipping west while Ember still hovers high. Ember rising alone to spread a honeyed glow across the waking surf, while Sol builds white heat behind it. From this dance, climate learns new tricks. The Hadley cells fatten, jet streams braid, monsoon belts become double-lidded, breathing with the beat of two stellar hearts. You can chart the twin sun world by its winds. Continental interiors, where the second sun scours, evening cool before it gathers. Archipelagos with breezes that never tire, and super twilight latitudes where dusk stretches like taffy across hours because Ember lingers near the horizon. Clouds are in thickness, stacked anvils that throw one shadow to the north and another to the east. When storms tilt, their anvils fork twin penumbras over wheat fields that gleam in two tonalities. Silver from Sol, brass from Ember. Life keeps immaculate accounts. Under dual irradiance, leaves become accountants of light, their pigments shifted toward broader spectra. Anthocyanins rise in prominence, not as panic pigments, but as regulators, baffles against overload. Stomata learn prudence. They open in the shoulder hours between suns, when light is kind and vapor deficit low, then constrict when both suns shout. Forests retime their photosynthetic gusto to the windows when only one star presides. In the tropics, palms grow fronds with micro-ridges, scattering surplus photons. In highlands, lichens arrange themselves like tiny parabolic dishes to hoard warmth when the rare night falls. Nocturnality becomes a specialization you earn, not a default. True night, when both suns are down, is a commodity. Owls adapt to double dusk, hunting when Ember sinks and Sol has yet to rise, or vice versa. Bats diversify. Some evolve eyelid filters, rosy membranes that admit Ember's mellow glow, but dampen Sol's glare. Others lean on echolocation refined to navigate two-shadow forests, where the geometry of obstacles shifts in real time. On beaches, hatchling turtles no longer follow a single bright promise. Conservation depends on carving dark corridors against a sky that insists on being generous. Humans meet this sky with superstition first, then engineering. The earliest myths personify the suns as siblings with different temperaments. Sol, the loud protector, Ember, the patient keeper of promises. In carve-marked caves, ochre hands paint double halos around deer and around the hunters themselves, as if to admit that every body owns two spirits, one cast by each star. The first time a long night arrives, a syzygy of geometry when the suns set nearly together and dawn delays. The hunters stop work and listen to rivers cooling. They learn fear not of darkness, but of timing. Agriculture begins with a calendar crisis. Sowing by a single cycle fails. Too much light cooks seedlings. Too little night starves pollinators of rest. The farmers solve it with shade. They invent louvered roofs of woven reeds, then hinged frames set on pebbled tracks. The first heliostats not to capture, but to refuse excess. The double sun world bursts the architecture of shadow. Villages bloom under pergolas with adjustable slats. Children learn to calculate azimuth by watching which lattice seam aligns with a second shadow at midday. The moon pressed into eccentricities writes a different tide chart. There are hunger tides, shallow as a breath, and lion tides heaped like shoulders, triggered when ember's angle forces the lunar bulge to overcompensate. Coast peoples do not learn 12 or 24. They learn 40. Each year is a stack of 40 tidal phrases, each phrase a behavior. Nets set here, weirs closed there. Boats grounded on purpose to let barnacles be scraped, while ember alone watches. Along estuaries, children paint chevrons on pilings to mark the highest joint ever wet. When a new chevron is needed, entire villages turn out with drums to rename the season. The oldest city I visit, its stones warm with centuries, is built inside a ring of pale mountains. Streets are narrow, ceilings low, balconies deep, everything learned from the geometry of twin light. At the city's heart stands the Shade House, a cathedral not to darkness, but to calibration. Inside, slatted domes rotate on soft teeth made from ironwood. Priests, not quite astronomers yet, walk the catwalks with ropes and counterweights to align the ribs so that midday becomes temporary dusk, perfect for grinding grain and for the quiet surgeries of midwives. When the first astronomer climbs the ridge and fashions a double gnomon, two uprights spaced so their shadow edges converge, time gains nuance. Noon is no longer a point, it is a short chord, struck when the two shadow edges kiss. The astronomer scratches a chart on a slate, the phase table, predicting when ember will lead and when soul will follow over the next 100 days. In one column, a farmer reads, 9 days hence, a shoulder hour plant beans. In another, a fishwife notes, long dusk, set traps early. The city breathes with new confidence, shoulders squaring against capricious skies. But the planet keeps wild cards. There are false evenings when dust lofted from faraway deserts turns soul into a copper plate, while ember beams clear, and white lullabies when thin cirrus doubles soul's glare into a softbox, and ember recedes so that everything is lit without a visible source. There are years when the sun's apparent separation shrinks and heat advisories multiply. Years when they drift apart on the sky and travelers pull shawls tight in late afternoons. In this world, the lesson is durable. You don't conquer a sky like this. You negotiate with it. Human culture becomes a diplomacy with light, drafted not in laws alone, but in louvers, calendars, pigments, and patience. Empires flourish where calendars rule. The twin light gave humanity a fickle sky. The first great states answered by domesticating it. Not by rockets or lasers, those would come later, but by logistics. They built shade roads, boulevard-length pergolas whose slats could be angled by communal pulleys, forming corridors that tamed noon for caravans. These roads stitched cities across latitudes where ember tended to trail soul, giving afternoons a perpetual slant. Grain moved without souring, the sick could travel without sun fever, and messenger runners learned to sprint by the metronome of moving shade. Power accrued to those who lit wisely. Glassmakers elevated sand into cathedral panes, doped with rare earths. Filters tuned to ember's warmer spectrum. In courts layered with tapestries, mandarins read edicts under amber windows that calmed agitation. The first medical colleges were built with double skylights, white for diagnosis, amber for surgery. Incisions under ember glass bled less, surgeons insisted. Whether it was physiology or placebo scarcely mattered. Faith in calibrated light became law. Warfare adapted. Commanders timed offensives for two-edged noon, when double shadows confused depth perception and archers misjudged distances by the length of the second blade. Armies painted their shields with twin halos, mouths of lions left unpainted so soul would glare off enamel, An ember would fill the gap with a dull glow. Siege engineers experimented with mirror barrages. Racks of polished copper tilted not to burn, but to saturate, blinding lookouts with an overload of cues. Compasses, already compromised by mineral mountains, lost authority. Armies navigated by shadow pole tables and by listening to which side of a shade road hummed with cartwheels. Religion crystallized around predictability, not fatalism, but covenant. The covenant of conjunction promised that when both suns set together, the world would receive a gift of clarity. Artists planned unveilings under true night. Judges reserved capital trials for it, arguing that mercy and justice both require a clean horizon. In some cultures, marriages were legal only on balanced eves, evenings of near-synchronous setting. Elsewhere, outlaw brotherhoods swore oaths under false evenings, a deliberate defiance, trusting dust to make night. The sea seeded new empires. With twin drives of wind and tide, sailors learned to play the interval, launching not on calm or gale, but on the hinge between them, those hours when the second sun flattened thermal gradients. Shipwrights shifted from square sails to latticed wings with adjustable membranes to drink whichever star offered better lift. In shallow archipelagos, fisher kings taxed lion tide passages, building gates that could be hoisted or dropped in minutes to trap shoals when the twin gravities made a trough long enough to herd fish like cattle. Then came the lens keepers. Not a guild at first, more a scattered curiosity. Monks and widows polishing discs from fused quartz to study the double corona during rare eclipses. Their work birthed the calculus of glare. They could measure stress in a beam by how its twin shadows parted. They could judge the quality of oil by the way it split soul's highlight and muted embers. When kingdoms fought over deserts rich in quartz sand, the lens keepers became diplomats, moving between courts with cases of lenses wrapped in soft camel hair. Through their instruments, the suns ceased to be deities and became systems. This cognitive shift unlocked energy. Where our Earth packed hills with windmills, the twin sun-Earth erected weavers, fields of mass-mounted vanes that could twist their axis to stitch two light sources into a single flux on a central boiler. Early weavers were fragile. Storms ripped them like spiderwebs. The second generation learned to fail gracefully, each vane a sacrificial petal, shedding itself under overstress so the rest could survive. Cities powered public fonts and cool houses through days that would once have emptied them. In the northern steppes, nomads bred shade bison, cattle comfortable under awnings, recognizably calm in the golden light of ember. Some herds evolved pigment on their eyelids like permanent coal that cut glare. Pasture lands hooked along mildness corridors, where the sun's phase offset moderated extremes. The steppes also birthed a technology of absence. The black loom, a textile that swallowed light without heating like a furnace. Woven from basalt threads tempered in brine. Black looms hung over desert courtyards turned noon into something almost gentle. Spies stole bolts of it. Other spies stole the brine recipe. Wars were fought in shade. Timekeeping grew theatrical. In capital plazas, double orreries spun, two jeweled suns circling a bronze earth, encircled again by a pearly moon that sometimes bucked to signal tidal anomalies. On feast days, children were allowed to pull the crank and push the system into a slow eclipse. The crowd would sigh as both model suns dipped behind a tiny mountain range. The lesson was not control but comprehension. We may not command the sky, but we can rehearse it. And yet empires learned humility. There were ash summers when a far volcano coughed light-eating veils. Ember swam as an ember indeed, and soul looked sick. Crops leaned into anthocyanins, but still faltered. In those years, cities revisited ancient rites, shared larders, open wells, cooling nights when whole districts slept outdoors on circular terraces, the old covenant renewed, darkness as medicine. There were magnifier years when the sun's apparent spacing pleased the reflectors and weavers too much, and energy seemed infinite. Great libraries wrote treatises on restraint in those years, fearing the cosmic whiplash that follows booms. Out on the rimlands, a practical mysticism matured. Farmers taught apprentices to read a roof. Listen to the louver's song. If it rattles, ember is leading. If it hums, Seoul is fat sailors judge courage not by facing storms, but by refusing noon when noon was a bully. Engineers refused straight lines. Every boulevard took a crease for shade. When strangers asked for a cultural summary, the elders laughed. We don't worship light, we negotiate terms. Today, in the archive where I speak to you, the map rooms are cool and amber. I pull a scroll from a shelf and read a proclamation from a long-crumbled dynasty. Let us name our strength. We placed our pride between two lights and asked for patience. We learned not perfection, but timing. History reserves its sharpest tests for systems that appear stable. The convergence was no apocalypse, no fire from the sky, no rending, but a long arithmetic of alignment. Over centuries, the orbital phasing drifted toward longer intervals when the sun's risings nearly matched. The people had names for this: long noon, welded day. On paper, it was a climate curiosity. In streets of glass and shade, it became an audit. Cities that had mastered shade discovered the cost of mastery. Maintenance. Bearings wore. Louvers squealed. Weaver fields needed more sacrificial petals than quarries could supply. The brightness that built them insisted on payment. Citizens who had come to expect cool corridors during any hour learned to queue, not for bread, but for shadow. Tempers frayed, playgrounds emptied. A generation of children learned their letters not under gentle slats, but in the flat bite of two suns, eyes narrowed, faces tense. Science offered tools, materials with microcavities, solid foams that bled heat into harmless frequencies, multiplied. Cold paint covered rooftops, radiating to the sky, even while taking punishment from soul and ember. City planners re-gridded neighborhoods into honeycombs of pocket plazas, each plaza a tiny ebb designed to pull thermal load out of the larger block. At night, precious night, circulatory boulevards pumped cooled air like blood. Civic pride shifted from ornate fountains to quiet ducts that made shade audible, a low, constant hush. But convergence wasn't just about heat. Psychology bent. True night thinned to a rarity measured in silence per decade. Dream cycles shortened. Circadian chemistry learned to anchor to temperature pulses and social cues rather than darkness. Sleep became civic, scheduled in civic darkness halls, large velvet-lined spaces with double doors and light locks. Infants learned to nap in white noise while embers shone outside. Their grandparents began to speak of stars as if remembering a childhood friend who moved away. Religion, already covenantal, grew practical. The covenant of conjunction reinvented itself as the ministry of intervals, a public office that treated light like fiscal policy, surpluses banked in thermal sinks, deficits addressed by rolling nights initiated with smart canopies. Priests preached calendars of mercy, close early on welded days. Open late on split mornings, city councils published light budgets with the same gravity as tax codes. In this pressure, a question sharpened. Should humanity intervene on cosmic scales? The proposal emerged from the high deserts, where engineers and lens keepers had collaborated for generations. Orbital reflectors, thin, gossamer sails stationed at Lagrange points, capable of shaving a few percentage points from Sol's contribution during critical hours, or redirecting embers' warmth toward polar farms starved by stubborn winds. Critics called it sacrilege. Supporters called it stewardship. The debate roared in plazas and under pergolas. Do we tilt the sky, even a little? The first reflector launched without fanfare, painted matte black to evade the populist rage that followed big announcements. It unfolded like a patient argument and took station where calculations said it would help most, above a belt of cities on a continent that had known 4 ash summers in a row. The effect was modest, barely within the margin of error for a harried citizen's day, but it was real. Evening commutes lost a degree. Operating rooms reported fewer heat-struck collapses. Night markets outlasted white lulls by an hour. Then as ever, systems coupled in ways nobody fully predicted. With slight relief in the belt, migration patterns nudged. Industry followed cheap comfort. Rural valleys, once rich in cool drafts, felt the drain as their carpenters moved to cities hungry for louver repair. Fields struggled for hands. In Parliament, a farmer held up a handful of dry soil and shouted toward the camera, "Whose light is this? Who allocates dawn?" The second generation of reflectors came with governance. Seats set aside for regions without launches, quotas pegged not to wealth but to vulnerability indices, real-time dashboards in public squares. Children learned orbital mechanics with chalk on shadehouse floors. The sky became a negotiated commons. But the convergence had one more lesson to teach, and it would speak in the voice people missed most: darkness. For all the civic nights and engineered evenings, nothing could replace a syncopation when both suns, through quirks of orbit and weather, chose to set almost together. And the moon, carrier of ancestral memory, rose fat over a calm sea. When such a night finally arrived after a decade of welded days, cities did something remarkable. They turned themselves off. If you had stood on a ridge above the Capitol, you would have seen it. The louvered roofs folded flat, the weavers stilled, the cold paints radiating into a heaven that at last accepted their gifts. Over the river, the ferries cut their engines and drifted. On terraces, people lifted their faces and wept, not for a lost past, but for a present finally rounded. I walked the streets that night as your narrator. The stones remembered heat but released it with sighs. Children pointed up at Orion. Some knew the name. Others called it lattice, for how the stars looked through the webbing of cables that spanned plazas. Old men leaned back against columns and traced twin arcs with their fingers, muscle memory of suns now asleep. For hours, the city was not negotiating with light. It was receiving it, or rather, receiving its absence. At dawn, both suns rose, misaligned again. Their old duet resumed. The city woke to work. But something in the civic posture had changed. The Ministry of Intervals published a new ordinance. Monthly dark holidays, non-negotiable, practiced regardless of orbital favors, engineered with civic canopies and thermal sinks. Schools wrote new lessons on interval literacy, teaching that resilience is less about equipment than about rhythm. Knowing when to press, when to yield. The orbital program matured. Reflectors became not umbrellas but mirrors for equity, adjustable to help highlands during ash veils, lowlands during lion tides. Like the louver that once saved a village at noon, the system's beauty lay in its modesty. People joked that the greatest monument of the twin sun Earth was invisible, until a child pointed out that every sleeping city was a monument, carved not in stone, but in timing. In the end, there was no utopia, no collapse, only a culture grown articulate in light. Markets learned to price the hour, poets learned to praise the hinge, architects learned to compose with glare and mercy. And standing on a rooftop, I learned the final vocabulary word the twin sun Earth insisted upon. Not control, not surrender, but cadence. We had become a species fluent in cadence. Where are you watching from, and what would you build first on a twin sun Earth? More shade or better nights? Tell me in the comments. And if you enjoyed this what if, subscribe for the next impossible world.